The title of this presentation is The Mystery of Curiosity by Tom Morgan of Sapient Capital. So why am I here today? Well, first, who am I? I was formerly in sell-side equity sales on Wall Street with Merrill Lynch, Bank of America, and then Stifel. What do I do now? I call myself a curiosity Sherpa for Sapient Capital. What does that mean? What do I do? Well, I try and find the most interesting ideas and people in the world, and then I apply these ideas to wealth and investing, and hopefully identify long-term themes and societal shifts. Now, this presentation probably won't make you any richer or make any successful economic forecast for 2024, but it might offer a whistle-stop tour of interesting ideas and propose some practical takeaways. We're in a bit of a pickle. We're calling it the meta crisis, which I think is just a slightly pretentious term for a series of different crises all happening at the same time. Firstly, there is a geopolitical and social crisis. The era of international conflict appears to be back upon us. There is also a social conflict. We trust each other less than we ever have before, and we're much more divided than we have been during previous decades. This is spilling into an institutional crisis, whether it's the media, politics, institutions like higher education, religion. We have less trust in these institutions than we have had before. And then there's an ecological crisis. According to the World Wildlife Fund, wildlife populations around the world have dropped 70% in the last 50 years, which, even if it's directionally correct, is troubling. And then finally, there's a mental crisis, a mental health crisis, which is pretty obvious for all to see, but is most grievously affecting our children, particularly our daughters. So if you're interested in these things, obviously you're going to want to read about them. But it seems to me that there's really only 3 articles that people produce. The first is the doomers. Those tend to be people in politics and on Wall Street. And that's basically 10,000 words of how everything's going wrong. And then if you're lucky, 1 sentence on maybe what we could do right. Then there's the techno-utopians. They don't struggle for things you can do right. The answer is technology, and it always is technology. Whether it's nuclear fusion, interstellar travel, artificial general intelligence, we just need more technology and faster to solve our problems. And then there's the trends guys. That's Steven Pinker, Hans Rosling, anyone that's ever given a TED Talk. And they say, put down the phone, go outside, touch grass, whether it's infant mortality, generational poverty, access to drinking water. The world has never been better. We are comfortable. And I think that is true. In fact, I think all of these perspectives have some truth in them. But there is a 4th option. And I think it's actually more interesting than the others. So this is the person who, if I was pushed, would say is the world's most interesting person. His name is Dr. Ian McGilchrist. He was invited up to the Genius College at Oxford All Souls 3 times, where he started in humanities, but then he became so interested in the structure of the human brain that he became a practicing psychiatrist and then later a professor of neuroimaging at Johns Hopkins. He wrote a book in 2009 called The Master and His Emissary, which gave me a completely new understanding of the world. And he followed it up with a book called The Matter with Things in 2021, which is certainly the best thing I've ever read. McGilchrist's focus is on the 2 hemispheres of the brain. And it turns out there's a lot of experimental sources for this research. There are stroke victims that get one side knocked out, likewise accidents that have one side of their brain damaged. And then there's corpus callosotomies, which is when the connection between the 2 hemispheres is cut in the cases of things like severe epilepsy. McGilchrist's diagnosis is that the world is imbalanced towards the brain's left hemisphere. Now, brain hemispheres, it feels like a topic that's been around for since we've all been alive, but I think it's broadly misunderstood. There was this pop psychology that basically, one side of your brain is creative and one side is mathematical. But the fact is that both sides of our brains can do pretty much the same things. But McGilchrist's point to the scientific rebuttals is that just because both sides can do roughly the same thing, it doesn't mean the way they do them isn't very important. And I think one of his favorite examples is that of a bird. The left hemisphere of a bird's brain has very, very narrow focus on the ground to see if something's a piece of sand or a piece of grain that it can eat. And at the same time, it's using its right hemisphere, very broad attention, to be on the lookout for cats. And ideally is switching between the 2 all the time, broad focus and narrow focus. When applied to humans, The nature of the left hemisphere, I think, is best described in one word, which is disconnected. Much like the bird manipulates the world and interacts with the world with its very narrow focus, the nature of the left hemisphere is to deal in abstract thought. It is highly, highly verbal. It deals in concepts and ideas. It is abstracted from the world. This means it also creates disconnected digital worlds. We see that in social media and video games. But because it's abstracted from the world and deals in single points of interaction, it can often make what is called naive interventions. My favorite example of this is Chairman Mao's Smash Sparrows campaign, where basically he found that sparrows were eating grain reserves, and so he instructed the population to kill them. They succeeded in this, but it created a locust infestation that was so bad it contributed to a famine that killed 50 million people. It is the worst man-made disaster in human history, and it was all because you changed one variable in a complex system without understanding how it impacts the rest. Moreover, the left hemisphere often sees living things as dead. If you experimentally suppress the brain's left hemisphere, you start to see things that you would ordinarily see as dead as alive. So the sun crossing across the sky, giving you energy. But if you experimentally suppress the right hemisphere, people start to see other living things as dead. So other people become furniture or machine-like. The left hemisphere also has very limited bandwidth. One of the things I read was that our conscious bandwidth is about 60 bits a second, which means if two people start speaking to you at the same time, you can't process both conversations. Meanwhile, our unconscious bandwidth is something like 11 million bits a second, which means, if I tell you to wiggle your big toe right now, you will suddenly be aware of the sensory input from your big toe. Your big toe didn't suddenly come into existence, but you're constantly being offered input from your environment all the time. And it would be overwhelming if you were taking all 11 million bits in at once. So you're constantly distilling it down to 60 bits. But that often means that the left hemisphere is an interpreter that has access to very, very limited information about its environment. The left hemisphere is also more competitive than cooperative in nature. So if the nature of the left hemisphere is disconnection, what are we disconnected from? Well, I think one of the most interesting answers is curiosity. We use the word all the time, but I don't think we spend enough time thinking about what it means. The dictionary definition is a strong desire to know or learn something. And if you reflect on that, that's a pretty disappointing definition because it doesn't really tell you anything. It doesn't tell you where the strong desire comes from, and it doesn't tell you how you pick the something. So the question I would ask, and I'd ask you to really sit and try and answer it, can you force yourself to be interested in something? Now, if I told you you had to spend the rest of your life as an actuary, how would you feel about that? Sure, it's good for some people, but maybe you wouldn't enjoy it. You could force yourself to do it, but could you force yourself to be passionate about it? Think about the things you enjoy and the things that you don't enjoy. Could I force you to watch a 5-day cricket test match or all 10 seasons of The Real Housewives of New Jersey? You are more interested in some things than you are in others, and you don't have full control of that. So if you don't fully control your interests, what does? Well, back in 2017, the controversial Canadian psychologist gave a lecture that I think is the most interesting lecture I've ever heard on the biblical story of Jacob's ladder. And in it, he talks about how the psychologist Carl Jung believed that your future self guides you in the present by directing your attention, by directing what you're interested in. That was an idea that really stuck with me, but it doesn't seem to have much basis in science. So let's look at the science. It turns out that our understanding of evolution as this Darwinistic dog against dog isn't entirely correct. Recent advances in complexity science shows that evolution actually trends towards complexity. And I think if you look outside, this is relatively intuitive. You've gone from rocks to plants to humans to the internet. Things are complex and they are getting more complex at an exponential rate. But I think we also have to step back for a second and work out what the definition of complexity is. It's a little bit difficult to get your head around because it almost seems like a paradox. Something that is complex has very, very differentiated parts that are also very integrated into the whole. What does that mean? So a topical example would be a Boeing. A Boeing has 6 million parts in it. But if all of those parts were the same part, not differentiated, you'd have a pile of screws. It wouldn't be a plane. And if those parts were not integrated, you would just have a pile of 6 million parts on a floor, all different, but not working together, and the door would fall out. But also the same can be applied to an economy. A not differentiated economy would be a country that just exports copper, very strong when the copper market is strong, very weak when the copper market is weak. If it's not integrated, then you would have something like an emerging market bazaar, where you have thousands of different businesses, none of whom are really working together. And then what you have when you have something that is differentiated and integrated, you have the supply chain miracle of modern capitalism, where all these differentiated businesses work together very seamlessly. But I think the best and most intuitive example of this is you. That you, if you were not differentiated, you would all be one cell. You're a slime mold. And if you were not integrated, all your organs and bones and skin would just be a sludge on the floor. The fact is that we are comprised of an incomprehensibly large number of differentiated parts that all work together to make a complex and coherent whole. So if evolution trends towards complexity, there has to be a force of evolution. And Ervin Laszlo, the great systems theorist, called this the holotropic attractor, which is a bit wordy, but it just means a force of the universe that drives us towards greater complexity and greater wholeness. Now, the thing about forces of evolution is that for them to act on us, we have to experience them somehow. And the world is combinatorially explosive, which means there's too many choices and too little time. Think about your romantic partner. Here's a grid of attractive faces. Some of them will be more attractive to you than others. You are attracted to them and they are attracted back to you. What we are attracted to narrows our list of potential options. In a sense, it has to feel like something. Now, the great mythologist Joseph Campbell intuited this. Having spent a long time working with mythology, you realize that mythology encodes information of evolutionary importance. And perhaps Campbell's most famous quote is, "Follow your bliss, differentiation, and doors will open where you didn't know they were going to be, integration." Now, that latter bit, integration, I think is very hard for us to understand, that your niche needs to love you back. Curiosity is a relational force. What does that mean? Well, is a great white shark well adapted to its niche? If you're in the ocean, yes, it's an apex predator. But if you drop that shark in the Sahara Desert, it's dead in 5 minutes. That's intuitively easy for us to understand. But I think you also have to apply it to information, that there are certain kinds of information and certain kinds of occupations, perhaps, that we are better fitted to than others. And that is something that we feel somatically. It is a relationship that we have with our niche. And when we are in the wrong niche, then we often feel very bored or dissatisfied. So therefore, there is this subtle pull towards complexity that we experience. Differentiation, when you're pursuing your own niche in the form of curiosity, it feels meaningful and it puts you in the flow state. Integration, that means that when you're pursuing your niche in the correct way, the environmental feedback is positive. These are fundamentally right hemispheric intuitions. And the fact is, the left hemisphere inhibits evolution through the form of disconnection. It blocks your felt sense, your feeling of bliss when you're pursuing differentiation, and it ignores external feedback. This leads to you being not differentiated. You do the same thing as everyone else, but you're also not integrated. You feel disconnected from life. So in summary, evolution in the form of curiosity helps guide you towards greater complexity, which is your unique niche. It's why you don't have full control of it. It is a relational force. The Taoists, I think somewhat embarrassingly 2,000 years ago, understood this. They believed that there was a deeper reality, a flow that you can harmonize with. And if you do so, your life goes great. But the ideal state was kind of this almost paradoxical, effortless action where your narrow will surrenders to these broader forces that work through you. Now, that actually makes a lot of sense when you relate it back to McGilchrist's theory, because he believes the right hemisphere should be the master and the left hemisphere should be the emissary, which is that external stimulus and feedback always needs to take priority over the narrow will of the left hemisphere, which means that it's almost paradoxical. It's you're taking cues from your environment and letting it act through you. Now, the way I like to think about this is of a steering wheel and accelerator. If you have just the left hemisphere and it's an accelerator. It's very powerful going down the straights, but the moment you hit a corner, you're in trouble. The right hemisphere is just a steering wheel. It can orient you in the world, but it doesn't move you forwards. If you have the left in charge, you're going to hit a wall. If you have the right over the left, you stay on the track. This is why the Taoists called it a path. So there are three takeaways from this theory. The first is relevant to business design. The second is relating to the societal tipping point in the meta crisis. And the third is relating to personal benefit. So business design, build greenhouses. Curiosity requires space, space for innovation within economies, space for innovation within companies. 3M developed Post-it notes because they gave their employees 15% of their working time to work on side projects. There is also a story that Gmail came out of Google's unstructured time, but also leaders, visionaries, and innovators throughout human history have always come across their greatest innovations when they're in unstructured time. And I think we need to start thinking of wealth as a greenhouse. It is something that gives us the space to explore our curiosity. And then there's a response to the doomers. Let's go back to the meta crisis. Pursuit of complexity can make us positive sum. When you find your own unique niche, it actually makes you less comparative, less acquisitive, and less competitive. You're on your own path. You care a lot less what other people are doing. And then becoming more holistic, more right hemispheric, makes us less destructive and more empathetic. We experience the world as alive, which makes us less willing to destroy it. But relating this back to the Four Horsemen, I think that right hemispheric perspective adds to more social trust. It creates more institutional compromise, which isn't something we hear a lot about. It leads to more holism in the way that we interact with our environment. And then it leads to reconnection in our mental lives, which is something that is perhaps the most important of the lot. These are all integration problems. But is it actually happening? Is the world becoming more right hemispheric? I would say maybe. We are seeing a scientific shift away from reductionism, in the forms of advances in quantum physics, chaos theory, and systems theory. We're also seeing a cultural shift. Richard Tarnatz has identified 30 different signs, from yoga to mindfulness to meditation. Is there any economic evidence for this? Well, the altered state economy is pegged at $4 trillion by author Jamie Wheal, which sounds like a ludicrous number until you think about all the different ways that we try and get ourselves out of baseline consciousness in a given day, whether it's caffeine, tobacco, alcohol, legal and illegal drugs. And I think you can watch shifts in that altered state economy to see whether we are indeed getting more right hemispheric. The psychedelic substance market is growing rapidly, and psychedelics reliably change worldviews towards something that I think we would describe as more right hemispheric and integrated. MDMA is also likely to have fast-track approval for PTSD sometime this year. And then I think perhaps more controversially, there's ESG and sustainability. These things got a bit of a bad rap, I think justifiably, for the last 5 to 10 years, because they were pursued very cynically in a lot of cases. But I think the demand from investors for sustainable investments reflects a shift in mindset towards a more sustainable economic model. And then finally, personal benefit. Whenever I'm listening to these presentations, I like to take stuff away that I myself can use. And the fact remains that reconnection is extremely good for you. I think what almost everyone wants is purpose. That's where what only you can do, differentiation, meets what the world needs, integration. And as I said earlier, evolution makes the right actions feel good. Differentiation into our gifts feels great. Follow your bliss, and doors will open where only there were walls. And then there's health. The effects of social connectedness on health, according to a landmark study, outstrip even those of diet, exercise, and smoking. But I think we need to think about connectedness, both in terms of social connectedness, our relationships, but also our relationships to the kind of information that makes us come alive again. Here's an example. Ed Thorpe, Founders Podcast, David Senra, has profiled about 220 different people, all the most famous people you've ever heard of, from Ferrari to James Cameron to Steve Jobs. And he said that out of all of them, his closest personal blueprint would be Ed Thorpe. And he says part of the way he had fun was that he genuinely followed his intellectual curiosity. And the fact is, if you look at Thorpe's life, if you're not familiar, he started as an academic, then he tried to break roulette and blackjack in casinos, and then he moved to starting one of the most successful quant hedge funds ever. What's notable about his life is that he pivoted very rapidly to follow his own intellectual curiosity. Last year, Paul Graham at Y Combinator wrote an exceptional essay called How to Do Great Work. And he says, if you came to an oracle and said, asked what the secret to doing great work is, the oracle would probably reply with one word, and that word is curiosity. Later in the article, he said, curiosity is the best guide. Your curiosity never lies, and it knows more than you do about what's worth paying attention to. It knows more than you do about what's worth paying attention to. It is a relational force. How do you do it? Well, there's internal practices like hypnosis, dream work, yoga, meditation. A lot of these get co-opted by annoying spiritual people. I think less focused, but more important, is that you have to really pay attention to environmental feedback, particularly things like synchronicities, which are meaningful coincidences. The left hemisphere says there's no such thing. The right hemisphere knows them when they see them, particularly a cluster. And the fact is that a 30-year wisdom study found that the number one correlate of wisdom was openness to new ideas, which completely makes sense in the context of the right hemisphere leading the left. So in short, increase your openness. So just to recap the presentation, 1, our imbalanced mindset is creating a crisis of disconnection. 2, we are disconnected from a fundamental force of the universe. 3, this is a drive towards greater complexity. 4, one important way we experience this drive is as curiosity. 5, embracing curiosity may help resolve our collective crises. 6, there's early evidence, perhaps, that it's already happening. And 7, even at a personal level, being curious is very good for your flourishing.